Om. 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 Om Sahana Vavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shante Shante Shante. Vakratunda Mahakaya Suryakoti Samaprabha Nirvignam Kurume Deva Sarvakaryeshu Sarvada. Sarasvati Namastubhyam Varade Kamarupini Vidyarambham Karishyami Siddhir Bhavatu Me Sada. Samasta Janakalyani Niratam Karunamayam Namami Chinmayam Devam Satgurum Brahma Vidvaram Mukam Karoti Vachalam Pangum Langhayate Girim Yat Kripatamaham Vande Paramananda Madhavam Paramananda Madhavam. We will read from verse number 7 to verse number 18. Karpanyatoshopahatas swabhavaha Prichami tvam dharma samudhachetaha Yachreyasya nishchitam bruhi tanme Shishyasteham shadhimam tvam prapannam Nahi prapashyami mamapanudyat Yacchokamuccoshanamindriyanam Avapya bhumavasapatnam riddham Rajyam suranam api chadhipatyam. Sanjaya uvacha eva muktva hrishikesham Kudakeshah parantapaha Nayotsya iti govindam uktva tushnim babhuvaha tamuvacha rishikeshaha prahasanniva bharata senayorubhayor madhye vishidantamidam vachaha. Shri Bhagavan uvacha ashochananvashochastvam Prajnavadanscha bhashase gatasuna nanushochanti panditaha natvevaham jatunasam natvam neme janadhipaha nachaiva na bhavishyamaha sarve vayamatah param. Tehinosmin yatha dehe kaumaram yauvanam jara tatha dehantara praptihi dhirastatra na muhyati matra sparshastu kaunteya shitoshna sukha dukkadaha agamapayino anityaha tanstitikshasva bharata yam hi navyatayantyete purusham purusharshabha samadukha sukham dhiram somritatvaya kalpate nasato vidyate bhavaha na bhavo vidyate sataha ubhayorapi drishtontaha Tvanayostattvadarshibhihi avinashitu tadvidhi Kena sarvamidam tatam vinashamapyayasyasya nakaschit kartum arhati antavanta ime dehaha nityasyokta sharirinaha anashino prameyasya tasmadyudhyasva bharata. Bhagavan Krishna says, Tasmad Yudhyasva Bharata. Therefore, Arjuna, do your duty. In this particular context, his duty is to fight. So Lord Krishna says, therefore, Arjuna, please rise up and fight. Do your duty. This verse number 18 is summarizing every single thing that we've seen from verse 11 to 17. It's like a small summary statement. And what does it say? It says, look, Arjuna, antavanta ime dehaha, means these bodies, they have an end. Antavantaha means they have an end. And these bodies have an end. But this Atma, which is Nitya, which is eternal, which is the Shariri, which is the one that in which the body appears, which is Anashi, which is the one that is indestructible, and Aprameya, and that which can never be objectified, that Atma, that's eternal. These bodies have an end, but this Atma is eternal. So therefore, Arjuna, you shouldn't grieve, because Atma, the self, cannot die, cannot perish, cannot be subject to destruction, and the bodies will die because that is their nature. In their own time, they will die. That is what their dharma is. So he says, there's no reason to grieve. Therefore, do what your duty is. Now, we saw that what is reality in verse number 16, that's a very important verse. A reality is that which has no absence, that which is always there, that which has no absence, that is called real. That which has any absence is called unreal. Because the self or Atma doesn't have any absence whatsoever in any state, it is called real. And this Atma, this eternal Atma, is only one. We see in this verse that in verse number 18, the bodies, the deha, it's said in plural, dehaha, bodies, means these bodies they have an end. But that Atma, nityasya sharirinaha, that Atma, only one, is eternal. So we see that there are many bodies, but there is only one Atma. And I explained this at the end of last class. I'll just touch upon it so that it becomes very clear. In Vedanta, this example of pot space is always given or always used. And when we think about the body and mind, intellect, equipment, think about them as pots. They are all just pots. The body and mind, intellect, equipment are different pots. There are many, many pots. And inside that pot is space. That space inside that pot is called Atma. And it's not that that space is only inside that one pot. That same space is inside all the pots. And it's not that only the space is inside, but it's outside also. Because space is both inside, it's outside. And in fact, in and through the pot is space. But we just call it pot space for our own comprehension. But really, that space inside the pot is infinite. You understand? That space inside the pot is really infinite because the pot cannot break the space or cannot divide the space. Pot cannot do that because in and through the pot, there is space. Inside the pot, outside the pot, in and through the pot, there is space. And pot cannot really break the space. So there is only one Atma But there's a feeling of many Atmas because there are many bodies and many minds and intellects. There's a feeling of manyness of Atma, but there's only really one. And you can take and contemplate on this example of space to illustrate that point. So therefore, when we say we are one, we are really one. There is no two. We are really one in our essential nature. And therefore, the pot being the body, mind, and intellect equipment, when anything happens to the pot, does anything happen to the space? So if the pot is too big, does the space get affected? If the pot is too small, too fat, too thin, too brown, too white, does anything happen to the space? Nothing. The space is ever unaffected. The pot can be black or white or brown or thin or fat, whatever. Nothing happens to the space. And the pot can even break. The pot can even break. But does anything happen to the space? Does it break? No. So therefore, this self is eternal because it's unbreakable. Even if the pot breaks, the self doesn't break. It's unbreakable. It's indestructible. And we also saw that self is all pervading. Avinashi tu tad vidhi. It is all pervading. And therefore, that is the self. That is who you are, O Arjuna. So don't think for 1 second that you can destroy or you are going to be destroyed. And this is what leads us to the next verse. This is the context for the next verse. Okay? So although we chanted it, I'll chant again and then you repeat. This is verse number 19. Ya enam veti hantaram.
Ya enam veti hantaram.
Yaschainam manyate hatam.
Yaschainam manyate hatam.
Ubhau tau na vijanitaha.
Ubhau tau na vijanitaha.
Nayam hanti na hanyate.
Nayam hanti na hanyate.
Ya enam veti hantaram. Yaschainam manyate hatam. Ubhau tau na vijanitaha. Nayam hanti na hanyate. Now this word vijanito, you will see in your books, it's vijanito. But when we take a pause, we actually break that, what we call sandhi. So it becomes vijanitaha when we break and we chant it. So that's why I chanted it that way. Okay? You'll notice whenever we break these words that have an o-kara, it becomes aha, it becomes that ha-kara. So I'll point it out to you as we go, but that's just so you know. Now here, what does it say? Ya enam hantaram veti. Ya, the one who thinks that, veti, the one who thinks, who sees it to be enam, this atma, this self, to be hantaram, the slayer or the killer. Yaha cha enam manyate hatam, and the one who thinks that this atma, enam, is hatam, is slain or is killed. Ubhau tau na vijanitaha. These two things they don't really know. Why? Na ayam hanti, this atma does not kill, na hanyate, or is not killed. So what is it saying here? He who takes the self to be the slayer, and he who thinks he is slain, neither of these knows. He slays not, nor is he slain. So I had explained to you that, when people read this verse, then it seems like, what is Bhagavan Krishna trying to say over here? Is this a a license to do whatever it is that we want? No, this verse has a very deep meaning. What Lord Krishna is trying to say is, Arjuna, this Atma, this self, who we talked about as eternal, as indestructible, he wants to make again very clear that this self is not an object or a subject of any transaction. He wants to make it clear that the self is not a doer. When he says the self is not the killer, what he really means is the self is not the doer. But because this context is battle, that's why he's saying the self is not the killer. And when he's saying the self is not the one killed, he's trying to say, Arjuna, the self is never the object of any act. But because we are in the context of battle, then he says the self is also not the one killed. So what does this mean? The self is not the doer. So as we saw last time, there is a triad in every experience, right? We see experiencer, the experienced object, and the experiencing process. This happens in every single transaction. In every single transaction, there is some kind of doer, experiencer, there's some kind of object, there's some kind of process going on. So in life's transactions, what Lord Krishna is saying is that experiencer, that doer, that seer, that feeler, that thinker, that is not the self. The one who takes themselves to be, I did this, I saw this, I heard this, I drank this, I ate this. That is not the self, and that has nothing to do with the self. So that's what it means by na, it's not the slayer, it's not the doer. And then also at some points in our life, we become the object of experience or the doer. For example, somebody smiles at us. Am I the one who is smiled upon? Am I the one who suffered? Am I the one who is hurt? Am I the one who is angered? So the other way also, we could be the object of something, right? So let's say if I said something to you, I, the speaker, said something to you. Are you the one who heard? Are you the one who listened? Are you the one who felt? Are you the one who understood? So you become the object of that action. What Lord Krishna is saying is you're not also the object of action. You're not the subject of action. You are not also the object of the action. Both of these things are in the realm of the transactional world, and Atma is just not in this realm. Now, I'll give you a simple example so that you can understand, and then we will see how to apply this, right? Simple example is, and everyone's gone through this example or this scenario wherein we went to some kind of fair. Let's say it's the summertime, right? And it is the summertime now, and the sun is shining very brightly, and we go to a booth. We go to some kind of cart where they're selling fruits, and there's a seller. A seller is there, and the seller is selling mangoes and different fruits. Now, I bought the mango in this bazaar. You know, there were so many different fruits, and I bought this mango. And I ate the mango, and I enjoyed it, right? So there's the seller of all of these mangoes. And you know what's going on in the seller's mind is nobody's buying right now. Nobody's buying anything right now. So the seller was so happy to see me. And I also ate the mangoes, and I also enjoyed the mangoes. That's what's going on in my head. Now, what is Atma in this transaction? What is Atma is not the seller, not the buyer, but the light or the sun that illumines the transaction. the sun that illumines the transaction, the sun without which no transaction can take place because there won't be any light. That is like Atma. That is not exactly Atma, but that is like Atma. So this self is outside of the transactional world. The self is that which illumines all transactions. The buyer, the seller, the doer, the enjoyer, the feeler, the thinker, the one who heard, the one who listened, the one who suffered. What's illumining those transactions is what we call the self or Atma. It cannot be I, the thinker, doer, enjoyer, because that's changing. So now, how do we apply this in daily life, right? Because this may seem like it's a license to do whatever we want, right? I'm not the doer, so I can just do whatever I want because I'm not the doer. So what's going to happen here is if we have that attitude that I'm not the doer, so I can do whatever we want, we will be very disturbed. Because in reality, only a sattvic mind or only a prepared mind can even come to this knowledge, can come to this knowledge that I'm actually not the doer, that there's something flowing through me. And what that looks like in daily life is a spirit of surrender. There's a spirit of surrender wherein there is no so much of an agenda, so much of an ego pushing, so much of a trying to control everything, trying to be on top of everything. There's just a simple feeling of ease, that something is flowing through you, something is going through you. There's no such ego wanting to assert itself. So Lord Krishna says, Arjuna, don't have that ego that you're the killer. That's Arjuna's problem, right? Arjuna's problem is, I'm going to kill, I'm going to war, I'm going to defeat. Lord Krishna says, don't even have that ego. That's not even you. And if you're afraid that you are going to be killed, don't even have that, because that's not also you. So hence, this shloka is about that, to tell us that Atma is out of this whole transactional phrase. It's out of this transactional world. It does not engage in anything. That self is that which illumines the transactions. Now, the question comes, why is it that you say that the self doesn't engage in any transaction? Why is Atma, or the self, not part of transactional world? So now, anticipating that question, he brings about verse number 20. Now, in verse number 18, he said, Antavanta ime dehaha nityaha ukta. He said, it is said that this Atma is eternal, etc. And so verse 19 and 20 they're directly pulled from Kathopanishad with a little bit of modification. But 19 and 20, because in 18 he said it is said that Atma is eternal, so he wanted to get some Upanishad quotes. So you'll find that verse 19 and 20 are pulled from Kathopanishad. So we'll read verse number 20. Na jayate mriyate va kadachit.
न जायते म्रियते वा कदाचित्
Nayam bhutva bhavita va na bhuyah.
नायं भूत्वा भाविता वा न भूयः
Ajo nitya shashvatoyam puranah.
अजो नित्यः शाश्वतोऽयं पुराणः
Na hanyate hanyamane sharire.
न हन्यते हन्यमाने शरीरे
Na jayate mriyate va kadachit. Nayam bhutva bhavita va na bhuyah. Ajo nitya shashvato yam puranaha na hanyate hanyamane sharire. So again, he reiterates, he says, this self cannot be part of any transaction because this self is najayate. This self was never born. Namriyate. This self does not die. Va kadachit, at any time. Nayam bhutva bhavita vana bhuyaha. And after having been, it's not that it ceases to be. Ajo, ajaha means it's unborn, nitya, eternal, shashwataha, changeless, puranaha, that which is ancient, na hanyate, and it is not killed even if the body is killed. So again, he's now telling us really that the self is free from any kind of modification. So we saw the Shad Vikaras and the 6 modifications. And again, in this particular shloka, it gives us these modifications. So first we have Najayate. Atma is not born. It's not created. It's not produced. So it's not that when the body is born, Atma is born. It's not like that. So whether the body is there or not, Atma is there. It does not have any birth. So again, think of this example of the pot and pot space, right? Just because the pot came doesn't mean space was born. Space is always there. It's just that one day the pot came. So whether or not the body is born, Atma is there. It doesn't have a birth. Najayate. It's so funny because we celebrate birthdays and we so love celebrating birthdays. But the real birthday or the real birth of a seeker is to know that we were never really born. That's the real thing. Namriyate. Namriyate means Atma doesn't die. Atma doesn't die. The self doesn't die. So even you take the pot, even if the pot breaks, nothing will happen to the space. Whether it's there or not there, the space is always there. So Atma's ever there. Even if the body goes, even if the mind, intellect, equipment goes, Atma is still there. And it says, kadachit means it's never, even before this whole, even when this whole creation was born, it's not that Atma was born with creation. So sometimes, people feel like, well, when did consciousness come? When did consciousness begin exactly? When was the first time it appeared? And there's so many studies about consciousness. But the very fact is, consciousness is beyond time, beyond space, and beyond object. So it is on which all of that is superimposed. And this is your direct experience. Your direct experience every night when you go to sleep. What happens? There is no time. There is no time when you go to sleep, when you are sleeping. And that's why when we wake up, we are looking at the clock to see what time it is, because we've lost time. When we sleep, we lose time. We have no idea what time it is. When we're sleeping, we lose space. And that's why when we wake up, we're trying to figure out where we are also. And sometimes we wake up and we don't remember how we got there. And when we're in deep sleep, we definitely lose objects. There is no objects. There is nothing. So when we wake up, that's our first feeling of the bed or the floor or whatever it is. So it is not only that Shastra or scriptures say it, it's your direct experience that you are there. Not even consciousness, because consciousness is you. So I'm not even saying consciousness as a third person. It's your direct experience that you are there. Even when time is not there, even when space is not there, even when objects are not there, you're there. Nobody else has to tell you otherwise. So kadachit means that. Even before the whole world appears, if we can say before, Atma is there. So Atma or consciousness, the self, now you have to use the term I. When we say Atma, we have to start saying I so that it becomes very clear. And that's why he says, ya ena, this, in the previous verse. Ena means this. So this I was never born. This I never dies. This I, even before creation, this I was there. This I will always be there. Even if everything gets destructed or destroyed, or everything dissolved, this I will be there. Every night, everything gets dissolved. This I is still there. And he says, na ayam bhutva. Having been there, it's not that it ceases to exist. Ayam bhutva bhavita vana bhuya. It's not that having been there, it ceases to exist. It's always there. And he says further that once you negate birth and you negate death, everything in between is negated, right? We saw the 6 vikaras, the 6 modifications. One is asti. It's there. Jayate means it's born. Varidate, it grows. Then viparinamate, it matures. Apakshiyate, it decays. And vinashyati, it gets destroyed. So he says it negates the whole thing. You negate birth, you negate death, you negate everything in between. And to reiterate that point, he says it is ajaha. Ajaha, there is no birth. Again, to reiterate that point, we might think that why is Bhagavan Krishna saying the same thing again and again? Because he wants us to really get it. These verses 11 to 25, as I told you, they are key verses in the entire Bhagavad Gita. If this is done, then everything else is done. We can just enjoy the rest of the verses. But if this is not done and this is not clear, then there will still be so many questions. So he says, ajaha, it is birth, it's unborn. Nityaha, it's eternal. And this shashwataha, shashwataha means it doesn't decay. Shashwata means it's changeless. It's not subject to any decay. It's not that Atma becomes old, Atma becomes weary, Atma becomes all kinds of things. No, so many things can happen to the body, mind, intellect, but nothing happens to Atma. Remember, nothing happens to that space. And he says, ayam puranaha. Puranaha means pura api navaha. It means that the self is ever there. It's ever there. It's not that it grew. It's not that it grew or it bloomed or it, became something else, some kind of different thing. Purana means it's ever as it was. It didn't grow. It didn't mature. And he says, Nahanyate hanyamane sharire. Means the self doesn't get destroyed even if the body gets destroyed. So again, he's repeating the same thought process, but he's hitting it in different angles. He says, whatever happens, the self is not destroyed, O Arjuna. So come out of that thinking. There is nobody doing, killing, and there is no killed in terms of the self. Now, so in the previous verse 19, it said, Na ayam hanti na hanyate. It said, the self does not kill nor is killed. So in verse number 20, it explained to us that the self cannot be killed, cannot be a part of this transactional way because it is not subject to any modification. It cannot change. It's ever changeless. Now in verse 21, again, he's going to reiterate that point. Okay, so we will see verse 21. Veda vinashinam nityam.
Veda vinashinam nityam.
Ya enamajam avyayam.
Ya enamajavavyayam.
Katham sapurusha partha.
Katham sapurusha partha.
Kam ghatayati hantikam.
Kam ghatayati hantikam.
Veda vinashinam nityam. Ya enamajam avyayam. Katham sapurusha partha. Kam ghatayati hantikam. So again here, Bhagavan Krishna is saying that the self is not the killer, does not kill anybody. He says, Yam ena, the one who this enam nityam avinashinam ajam avyayam veda means the one who knows this Atma which is avinashi, which is indestructible, which is ajam, unborn, which is avyayam, which is immutable, imperishable, then saha purusha partha, this person partha, katam kam ghatayati and kam hanti, means what else can cause it to kill and what can it kill. So here it says, whosoever knows him to be indestructible, eternal, unborn, and inexhaustible, how can that man slay, O Partha, or cause others to be slain? So, kam ghatayati. This ghatayati means how can anybody cause anyone to be slain? Because now we sort of negated Arjuna's role, right? Arjuna is going to be the slayer, or what we say is the slayer. So we negated that in the previous verse 19. And we also negated that Arjuna could be the one who's slain, right? So now Bhagavan Krishna is also saying, Kam ghatayati, who can also cause anybody to slay? He's negating his role, that there can be nobody to cause anybody to slay. There can be no roles here. So there is no slayer. There's nobody slain. There's nobody causing you to slay. There's none of this in the self because the self is changeless. So therefore, the main context that Bhagavan Krishna is telling Arjuna is, knowing all of this, do your duty, Arjuna. Knowing who you really are, knowing what this is all about, do your duty. So this verse is just sort of concluding what started in verse 19, saying it's not part of the triad because it's changeless, and therefore, Arjuna, therefore, do your duty. Do your duty because Atma is immutable. Now, in verse 22 is a very interesting example of what really happens when a body dies. So, you know, Puja Gurudev always says this very beautiful thing. He says, every body dies, but nobody dies, right? So every body dies, but the self, being the self, nobody dies. So in verse 22, we see what exactly happens when death takes place. So again, these are all really famous verses of the Bhagavad Gita. So let us see verse number 22. Vasamsi jirnani yatha vihaya
Vasamsi jirnani yatha vihaya
navani grinhati naroparani
navani grihnati naroparani
tatha sharirani vihaya jirnani
तथा शरीराणि विहाय जीर्णानि
anyani samyati navani dehi
अन्यानि संयाति नवानि देहे
vasamsi jirnani yatha vihaya navani grinhati naroparani tatha sharirani vihaya jirnani anyani samyati navani dehi. Now, if one has a question as to what is death? You know, you said that the self is indestructible. You said it's immutable, it's changeless, nothing can happen to it. But what is this phenomenon called death? What happens to people when they die? We know nothing happens to Atma, but what is happening to that body? What is happening to that jiva when death happens? So here it says, yatha, just as naraha, just as a person, what happens? Jirnani vasamsi, old clothes, vihaya, having cast away old clothes, what do? Navani grinhati aparani. They take aparani, they take other new clothes. They take up other new clothes. Tatha, the same way, tatha, this dehi, this embodied being, jirnani sharirani vihaya, it casts off its old body, andyani navani samyati, and it takes on a new body. So what does it say here? It says, just as a man casts off his worn out clothes and puts on new ones, so also the embodied self casts off its worn out bodies and enters others which are new. So how do we look at this particular verse? How we look at this verse is like this. Every single time we have a function, we have a certain form or a certain fashion to use. For example, if we're going to work, like some people are starting to go to work, so you dress differently. You dress differently, you wear different clothes. Some people might wear a suit. Some people might wear, you know, a pant, a formal top, semi-formal attire, and that's what you would wear. But then when everyone comes home, it's very different, right? Because then now you can be comfortable. Now you can take off all such tight clothes and you can wear something. You wear sweats, you can wear something loose, comfortable. Or when people go to the gym, then they wear gym clothes. You can't wear work clothes when you go to the gym. You have to wear gym clothes because that's what you're going to do. Or if someone goes to a party, you can't just wear regular clothes because every single party, there's some kind of attire you have to wear. Some beach attire, some Hawaiian attire, some kind of attire you have to wear. So you have to dress appropriately. So what happens in the world is we see whenever we enter a new field, we have to dress appropriately. We have to dress according to that field because we're entering into that new field. And it is we who wanted to enter that field, by the way. We wanted to go to the party. We want to go to work. We want to go to the gym. It is we who want to do all of these things. We are entering a new field, and therefore we need new clothes. Because the old clothes, they're just not going to cut it. It's not going to function in these new avenues. Like I can't wear a really formal dress to the gym. It just won't work. right? So this we see in our daily life, that whenever there's a new field, we have to wear our attire accordingly because we want to. In the same way, what happens to the jiva? So now you know, and I've mentioned before, there are three aspects, right? If we put it as three aspects, it's easy. One is what we call the body, which you can see, so there's no doubt about it. The second is what we call jiva. Jiva means this mind, intellect, equipment endowed with life. That's called jiva. And the third is atma, or the self. So very clearly the self is distinct from jiva. Okay? What happens is, when the jiva no longer can function through this particular body, it feels that it could be that the body's still young, not necessarily that the body's old. When we say old in this particular verse, it really means the jiva can no longer function through that body. So when the jiva can no longer function through that particular body, it has so many desires. It has so many desires, but it cannot express it anymore in this body. It can't do it anymore in this body. Let's say that jiva's body could be 60 years old. Let's say the jiva's body could be 60 years old, but the jiva still wants to do so many things. You know, so many things, wants to travel, wants to explore, wants to run, wants to do this, wants to do that. It can't anymore express in this body. It exhausted all of its capacity to express in this body. Then that jiva will say, now I need to take up a new body. Now I have to go and I have to take up a new body. So then that jiva will leave that particular body. Who leaves? The mind, intellect, equipment endowed with life, that leaves. That leaves and that takes up a new body, and that is called death. So death is what? Death is changing clothes. How the Gita has put it, death is like changing clothes. Death is a process of changing bodies. This is what is shown in our Shastra. Who changes bodies? The jiva, not Atma. Atma is always there. Atma is that in which everything takes place. That jiva, the mind, intellect, equipment with the manifestation of life, that jiva changes bodies. Now, when does this jiva change bodies? When? Who determines when this jiva will go? Is it you who determines it? Is it me who determines it? The jiva himself or herself determines it. Just like you yourself will say, I want to go to that party, so I'm going to wear these clothes. I want to go to the gym, so therefore I'm going to wear these clothes. It's the jiva who determines it. It's not up to you, up to me. It's not even up to God. Because it's that jiva who really says, I cannot express through this body. I have exhausted all of my possible expression in this body that I cannot do it anymore. So it's the jiva who decides. So sometimes we will find that even somebody very young will have to go. But it is their decision. We cry and we weep because we don't understand it, because again, we're not looking at the whole entire picture. But that is what it is. So the jiva is the one who leaves, and the jiva decides when the jiva leaves. Now, what kind of body will the jiva get? What kind of body, what kind of environment will that jiva get? That jiva will get the kind of body or environment as per its karma and vasanas. So whatever its karmas, past karmas are, whatever its vasanas are, accordingly that jiva will get that kind of environment. So when you look at your life and my life, Why is it we got this body? Why is it we got this environment? Why are we in this place right here and right now? It's because at some point in time, you and I desired it. You and I wanted it. That's why we're here. That's what's pushing us. That's what's pushing us birth after birth. It's our desires. It's our vasanas expressing as these desires. So this is how then that jiva gets into a new body. And when does it happen? When the jiva says, when the jiva feels it is ready, it goes. The jiva goes. Now, how long will this jiva go from body to body, from body to body, from birth to death, from birth to death, from birth to death? How long will this jiva go on? This jiva will go on as long as it thinks it's a jiva. As long as it thinks that it's the mind, intellect, equipment, I'm a jiva, I'm a doer, I'm the enjoyer, I'm this individual. It will keep going again and again and again. The only way to snap out of this going back and being born again and again and again is to realize that we are actually the self in which everything takes place. We are not the ones who's moving, the ones who's thinking, the ones who's doing. We're not all of that. We are that in which the whole thing takes place. So this example is very, very powerful. It makes us really understand this whole process of death, which can be so hard to accept, so painful to accept, especially when it's somebody who is going before their time, we say. You know, when someone older passes away, we say, yeah, because he was old or she was old already, so it's okay. Not much pain and not much suffering is there for the family and for the loved ones. But particularly when somebody is very young and passes away, we tend to question a lot. Some people might also say, but you know, I mean, how does it, what if it's just an untimely, like a disease or a virus or something like that? What if it's that kind of death, you know, which unfortunately we are facing right now? In that context, there are no accidents. There are no accidents per se. And those of you who are watching Puja Gurudev's talk, you would have heard how he explained that everything is in the realm of cause and effect. There is a cause for everything. It's not some random thing. Every single cause has an effect. But the thing is, you and I don't see all the causes and don't see all the effects. So we're so quick to judge and we think we know it all, but in reality, we don't. So now, this is what happens. Now, for us to understand what happens to Atma. So we've shown you in this verse that the body is discarded, right? The body is discarded and that jiva takes up a new body. Just like a wearer takes on new clothes, the jiva takes up a new body. Says, I can't express you this anymore. Taking up a new body. Peace out. The jiva says that. To understand Atma's role, I'm going to give you a different example so you can see, because many times people need to see this part also. The example I'm going to use here is a building in New York City. Okay, let's say there's a building in New York City and let's say there's a boutique in that building. And the boutique in that building, it is currently, it's selling clothes. It's selling really nice, fashionable clothes. But the problem is people are not buying. People are not buying anymore. And so business is going down. So they have to close, right? So the store owners, what they do is they decide that they're going to close that business. They're going to close that business and then they're going to reopen a different business. And what business is always successful? It's food, right? Because everybody keeps eating and eating and eating. That everybody will do. So people can, they will spend money on food. So he opens a food place in that building. And so what's happening there is that if you take that boutique as the body, right? That fashion clothes boutique as the body, and the owner said, I can't sell anymore. I can't do business anymore in this building. So he breaks down that body, and he starts a new body. And his body is this food business, whatever food business it is. He takes it up. So very clearly we see the body and we see the jiva. Where is Atma? Atma is the space in which all of this is taking place. The space in which all of this is taking place is what we call Atma, or the self. So you can clearly see in this second example that I gave you, nothing happens to the self. Whether the building is rising, it's a fashion boutique, or whether it's a food chain, whatever, whether it's in construction, whether it's in destruction, whether the owner wants it this way or that way, nothing is happening to that space, isn't it? That space is just there, changeless, immutable, indestructible. That space is Atma. So the one going through transmigration is not the self, is not Atma. That is what we call jiva. And as I said, as long as that jiva thinks it's a jiva, it will go through this whole transaction. But when this jiva realizes its true identity as Atma, then everything ceases. Okay, so now we've covered quite a bit today. There are some questions, but what I will do is I will summarize. I'll say the closing prayers, then I'll answer these questions after, okay? Because they may take a little bit more time. Today, I'll just spend a few moments summarizing. What we saw is from verse number 19. And in verse number 19 is where Lord Krishna really said, listen, Arjuna, you are not the one you're not the slayer, nor are you the slain. And what he really meant by this is, Arjuna, you are not the doer, nor the object of any action. You are not in this transactional realm. You, meaning the self, that Atma, you are not in this realm. So stop thinking that I'm doing this and I'm doing that. You are not the doer, Arjuna. And this is not an excuse. Again, this is just to put to light what the self really is. And he says, you cannot be the doer or the object of any action. Why? Because in verse 20, because Atma is immutable. It's never born. It never dies. It does not decay. It does not grow. And even if the body dies, nothing happens to the self. And in verse 21, we saw the one who knows this Atma, who's changeless, who's unborn, who's immutable, how can he or she think that they are the killer, or how can there be anybody prompting to kill, and how can anybody kill? Who can they kill, right? And then in verse number 22, then we see the whole phenomena of death, that nothing at all happens to the self. Just keep, one example that you just keep in mind is pot, space, and pot. So even if the pot breaks, nothing happens to space. The pot is there, nothing happens to space. So nothing happens to that Atma. But what's happening with the Jivatma is that they are transmigrating from one body to another when they feel that they are ready for it. They can no longer express through their particular body. Okay? So we will say the closing prayer, and then I have some questions in chat, so I will answer them. Okay. Om Purnamadav Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Harihi Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Harihi Om.